I'm delighted to see so many people have joined us, and we know more are coming. My name's Zoe Reed. I'm the chair of SACU, and I wanted to welcome you to this really important event in SACU's calendar. A few words about SACU, the Society for Anglo-Chinese Understanding. It's been building and promoting friendship and understanding between the peoples of China and the UK for over 55 years. So we're a small voluntary organisation, and as you can imagine, we're absolutely alarmed at the increase in hate crime against people of Chinese heritage here in the UK. And so therefore we thought we'd put together an expert panel to help us think about the whole issue and how we can tackle xenophobia. So we set out a brief, and we asked the panel to address the following points. So when they present, you can see if they read the brief. What we said is that the purpose of this panel is to help us all develop ideas on how we can stand up to xenophobia. We needed to understand xenophobia in its particular forms and tropes, and the impact on people it's having on people of Chinese heritage in Britain today. So we asked them to think how we can work together to solve the issue. So the focus of this panel is to provide us with some suggestions and practical ideas about what we might do together to tackle the problem right here and now in UK. We were delighted when all four of the people we wanted on the panel all said yes. So that meant they had less time. So I'm afraid they've all been constrained to about 9 minutes maximum to address this brief, but they're really all expert and able to do so. So our panel comprises Dr. Diana Yeow, Anna Chen, Yao Poon, and Sabby Dhalu. And when I introduce each of them, I'll say a little more about them. And we really are honoured to have such a highly distinguished panel with us to address this brief. But before I invite the panel to make their contributions, and then there'll be questions and answers after that, I wanted first to welcome Jenny to give us a bit of a historical perspective. Now, Dr. Jenny Clegg is a SACU Vice-President, a former senior lecturer in international studies and a China specialist. She's an author of a number of books, including China's Global Strategy Towards a Multipolar World and Fu Manchu and the Yellow Peril, The Making of a Racist Myth. And it's that particular perspective that she's going to introduce us to now. So Jenny, it's really over to you to share your slides and take it away.
Okay, thanks very much, Zoe, and hello to everybody. Before I get going here, I just want to make clear that I'm not actually going to be saying very much about Chinese culture or Chinese people. So you're not going to learn very much from me on that count. So apologies in advance if I disappoint. My story starts over 100 years ago with a young man called Arthur Ward, standing on the corner of a street in a not very salubrious part of London. Now, Arthur Ward hadn't made much of a success of his life so far. He'd tried writing musical pieces, but that hadn't gone very well. So he'd now taken up journalism and was looking for a story to make a few bob. The year was 1911. The place was Chinatown, a few streets in Limehouse near the docks. And he was hoping to unearth some criminal dealings and drugs, because the Chinese were commonly associated with drugs since the Opium Wars. Anyway, he stood there, not much was going on, until he happened to see a rather well-dressed and distinguished Chinese gentleman entering a rather shabby establishment, and he began to wonder, what business did he have there? Maybe he was a big boss in Chinatown. And from this, he began to weave the stories of Fu Manchu. A first series of short stories proved immensely popular. A second series was commissioned. This then led to novels and onto the silver screen in the 1920s, whereupon the whole Fu Manchu phenomena crossed the Atlantic to Hollywood with more movie blockbusters, radio series, comic strips, TV series, and cartoons. Fu Manchu is first introduced to us as the personification of the threat from the East, a yellow peril, with Fu Manchu masterminding a dangerous conspiracy to undermine Western civilization and take control of the world. He's immediately alien, scarcely human, combining the qualities of the exotic and the evil, alluring but dangerous, fascinating yet sinister. The first story opens with these words: imagine a person tall, lean and feline, high-shouldered, with a brow like Shakespeare and a face like Satan, a shaven skull and long magnetic eyes of a true cat green, and invest in him all the cruel cunning of the Eastern race accumulated in one giant intellect. From his lair in Chinatown, Fu Manchu plots to assassinate leading British politicians, scientists and diplomats to bring down the entire British Empire. So in 1911, Britain was in the midst of a Yellow Peril hysteria, which erupted periodically since the 1880s, when the Chinese first appeared on our shores, working as seamen on the steamships. Despite their very small numbers, then in 1911, only about 1,300, just a few hundred in London, the Chinese were particularly targeted in the early rounds of immigration legislation, associated as they were with drugs and crime. And Chinatown became subject to the attention of government authorities, police and the media, out of all proportion to their actual presence. The Fu Manchu stories clearly played on popular racialized stereotypes of Chinese people, which had accumulated over decades from impressions conveyed back to Britain by diplomats, travelers, soldiers, and missionaries who were less than favorably impressed, finding the Chinese unwilling converts to Christianity. So the sheer numbers of the population was a source of fear of the loss of individuality, the idea of getting lost in faceless crowds. And this was compounded by the notion of inscrutability. Chinese habits of self-restraint and polite conduct were construed as secretive and deceitful, a lack of expression taken as being insincere. The terrible conditions the Chinese people endured as their economy crumbled in the latter half of the 19th century gave rise to the idea that the Chinese were impervious to pain, insensitive, and not quite human. The Chinese were seen as particularly susceptible to opium addiction, and not just criminal, but morally degenerate and depraved. And the Qing government's use of methods of torture seemed to exhibit a peculiar racialized cruelty. Now, what I want to do is to try and share my screen to show you some images and stills from the films. These were the earliest films were made in the early 1920s, and these are from the late 1920s and early 1930s. So I'm not, just bear with me a moment. I am now screen sharing, but I've got the wrong image. So, no, I haven't, I've got the right image. So that should be okay. So is everything okay? So here we are. This is a poster from, actually, this is The Drums of Fu Manchu, which was made in 1940. And just look at that title, World Dictatorship. Cruel, insidious, treacherous Dr. Fu Manchu is ruthless in his mad scheme to rule the world. So there we are. Now it should be moving on, but I'm not sure why it's not. Right. Arthur Ward changed his name to Sax Roma to make him sound exotic and intriguing. Obviously, he was a bit of a poser. He knew absolutely nothing about Chinese people or Chinese culture, yet he made so much money out of his invention of Fu Manchu that he ended up signing the S in his name with a dollar sign. and the next one. And of course, he started a whole tradition of Oriental villainy, and these are some of the Oriental villains that came subsequent to Fu Manchu, some of whom which we can recognize. And believe it or not, over 100 years later, his books are still selling well on Amazon and Kindle. So let's have a look now at some of the images from the films. It's inhuman, anything but that. So these were tales of Chinese thugs and criminal gangs, of tenacious policemen, damsels in distress, and terrible tortures. Chinatown is a place of darkened alleys harboring a sinister presence in the heart of London's modern metropolis, threatening the empire from within its very capital. Fu Manchu and Chinatown are the threat within our midst. Behind Fu Manchu is an organized, clandestine, impenetrable network made up of the Tongs, close-knit kinship groups. And these gangs are seen as the forerunners of the Asian hordes that are about to sweep Europe. The unorganized multitudes of the East, who under Fu Manchu's command are transformed into a single-minded, remorseless force bent on world domination. So the Chinese are made to appear as alien and unsimilable, indelibly criminal, operating not simply beyond the law, but beyond the bounds of humanity. Oh no, not that. As I said, the Chinese are commonly associated with drugs, and Fu Manchu uses the most sinister, ghastly, and deceptive of means. Vile potions slipped into a cup of tea, an innocuous centipede proves deadly poisonous, mysterious gases overwhelm people without their being aware. And all this helps to establish the alien nature of Fu Manchu's powers. Your mind is completely under my control. So Fu Manchu can reduce people to mindless automatons, easily manipulated and controlled. And here in particular is the threat to womanhood, dressed symbolically in white, pure, and the purity and innocence of women, a symbol, a mark of Western superiority. Fu Manchu has tentacles all over the world. So here we see China, Africa, with the African slaves in the background. The tentacles of his organization reaches everywhere to amass, and I quote, fully 25% of the colored races. So not only mobilizing the Chinese, but also enslaving Africans. And Chinatown is the nerve center of an organization with international reach all around the world. Oh my goodness, what's this? Maybe it's the Wuhan lab. Fu Manchu is no ordinary villain. He's a genius of princely rank, holding degrees from 3 European universities, a master not only of the occult, but of Western sciences, with all the modern technologies at his disposal. This is a combination which makes him even more threatening. And of course, you may recognize the face here. That's Boris Karloff. Fu Manchu was never represented by a Chinese actor. In previous images, it was an actor called Warner Elland, I believe. So anyway, we know all about the power of science. Science must be balanced with ethics to be put to good use. But what if science should fall into the wrong hands? Eastern cunning versus Western acumen. So this is the ultimate still, if you like, the ultimate image of Fu Manchu. We cannot have villainy without a valiant hero. Counterposed to Fu Manchu is Sir Dennis Nayland Smith of the Foreign Office. Recently returned from distant lands, Sir Dennis is well versed in the wiles of Orientals. He acts, and I quote, not in the interests of the British government only, but in the interests of the entire white race. And I honestly believe, though I pray I may be wrong, that its survival depends largely on the success of my mission. So this is the height of the tensions in the stories and the films, is when these two come face to face. The more brutal, cunning, and intelligent is Fu Manchu, the more the mettle of Nayland Smith is put to the test. and proved to prevail. Whereas Fu Manchu is sinister, cold, remorseless, a remote, soulless menace, Nayland Smith is steadfast, brave, undaunted, and persevering. Where Fu Manchu is, surrounds himself with an entourage of thugs, criminals, and slaves, Nayland Smith rallies the support of courageous policemen and a host of honest friends. Where Fu Manchu uses trickery, deceit, and fear, Nayland Smith inspires bravery, loyalty, and initiative. The threat from the East is no mere threat, but an existential threat to civilization itself. This is a race war, the final outcome of which is could be the obliteration of all that is human under Fu Manchu's totalitarian powers. What is at stake is humanity itself. This is the fight to the finish of Western civilization against the barbarian world. So just a couple more pictures now. So this is Chinatown round about 1911. It seems so bizarre, doesn't it, that when the numbers of the Chinese in Britain were so small, that they were seen as such a threat to the social fabric of our society. Fu Manchu, of course, was plotting world domination at a time, in fact, when British imperialism had reached its zenith and China was, in fact, in a very weak state. It was the British that had forced opium onto the Chinese people. They were the first international drug traffickers. It was the British that sent its armies, guns, and cannons to exercise brute force. And it was the British that were to be the liars and the cheats, secretly handing German concessions in China over to the Japanese at the end of World War I. Now, of course, the collapse of the Qing dynasty in 1911 and the establishment of the Republic of China was an intimation of a challenge from a rising Asian nationalism. And Sun Yat-sen, China's first president, himself a doctor of medicine, might well have been a role model for Fu Manchu. But the history of these Yellow Peril scares is surely a case of victims made perpetrators with everything turned upside down. So as I said, you weren't going to learn very much from me about Chinese culture or Chinese people. Let's just remember the words of Edward Said in his book on Orientalism, in which he said, he talks about the central idea of Orientalism as that Western knowledge about the East is not generated from facts or reality, but from preconceived archetypes. It involves a constellation of false assumptions underlying Western attitudes to Asia and the Middle East. So he sees Orientalism and what we know of the Orient as a Western construct, a political vision which promotes the difference between the familiar, Europe and the West, and the strange, the Orient and the East. So Orientalism was not about the study of the East, it was actually the exercise in cultural power, creating authority over the Asia and the Middle East. So I'm just going to finish now with my final observations. I'll try and stop sharing the screen. Which I don't seem to be able to do at the moment. So I don't know whether anyone else can stop the screen sharing. It's just not working. Anyway, I'll just finish while somebody tries to sort that out. I mean, for me, the particular significance of Fu Manchu is the way the stories spread the Orientalist notions amongst the wider mass of the population. How did Fu Manchu become so fixed in the popular imagination? That's what I always ask myself. And I think it's important to remember that the Fu Manchu stories came amidst the flourishing of mass popular culture with the spread of mass media, newspapers, films, and radio. Sax Rohmer was the first pulp fiction writer breaking out of the elaborate style of Dickens, and Fu Manchu films were amongst the first talking pictures. To a working class becoming politicized in these years of the rise of mass trade unionism and the Labour Party, learning about socialism, Fu Manchu film served as an ideological enforcer upholding the status quo, asking the public, in the name of Western civilization, to put race above class interests.
Thank you, Jenny.
Have you managed to stop the screen sharing?
I think I have, yes, I think I have. Thank you, that was a really good introduction to a racist myth. So that's a fabulous backdrop. Now, before I invite our first panel speaker, just to say we're now at 132 people, so that's excellent. Many people did as we requested and sent in their questions in advance, but there is the Q&A function if you want to post any further questions, and we'll be coming to those later. So our first panel member I'd like to welcome is Dr. Diana Yeow. So Diana is a senior lecturer in sociology, culture and the creative industries and Associate Dean, Equality, Diversity and Inclusion for the School of Arts and Social Sciences at City University. So we're absolutely delighted to have Diana start us off as our first panel member. Diana, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much to SACU for inviting me to speak. It's a great pleasure to be here with all of you to think through some of the issues surrounding anti-Chinese or perhaps should we say anti-Asian racial violence. So this is actually the first question I want to address in my short time. So clearly much of the COVID-related discourse that we've been hearing is specifically xenophobic, i.e. anti-Chinese. We only need to think about Trump's couching it as the Chinese virus. But as we also know, the repercussions have been much wider. So that is affecting anyone looking Chinese, mainly but not exclusively light-skinned East and Southeast Asians. So the first cases of physical racial violence were experienced, in fact, by a Thai city worker who was left with a broken jaw. And soon after, the kind of structural nature of the kind of racism was highlighted when a Vietnamese curator was discharged from an art fair by her gallery, who feared that her presence would put off visitors. There have also been several reports of Filipinos experiencing COVID-related racial abuse. Of course, as we know, many of these are healthcare workers and are also suffering the highest COVID-related death rates. So for me, I'm actually more interested, I think, in a question of anti-Asian racial violence more broadly. However, I also think it's distinctive in the fact that it can be defined precisely by its disavowal. So I think all racialized groups are affected by the denial of racism in this post-racial moment. You know, the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities report, which was released last week, is like one of the most shocking and blatant examples of this. But in the case of East and Southeast Asians, I think the disavowal of racism is specifically shaped by our racialization as a model minority. And in this discourse, largely because of the racialized stereotypes that we do well in education and employment, and are supposedly well integrated into society, we're assumed not to experience racism or racial disadvantage. So much of what I'm going to go on to say in terms of what we can do to fight anti-Asian racism constructively responds to the 2 points that I've just made. And I guess it's a kind of a series of points for us to think about. So the first one is about expanding our political imagination. I think we need to tackle the problem of Chineseness and sinocentrism, which erases the experiences of entire other communities, rendering them completely invisible. So in saying that, we need to build broader communities of resistance with East and Southeast Asians as a broader community. We also need to recognize that the racial violence affects communities more widely than even those who also look like us. So the kind of racial violence that we've seen since COVID has also been experienced by Black and other minorities, South Asians, Roma, travelers, undocumented migrants, each of these groups has seen a rise in racial violence towards them since the outbreak of COVID-19. There's also been anti-Semitic and Islamophobic conspiracy theories. So I think we need to see what's happening with anti-Asian racial violence in this broader context. And related to that, my second point is that we need to build interracial solidarities. We need to address anti-Blackness and respectability politics within our own communities. That means interrogating the model minority myth and the privileges that it affords us. We need to recognize that the model minority is not just a stereotype, but a part of our oppression, as well as the oppression of others. And that racism against us and against others is interdependent. And this is why we need to build communities of resistance and forms of interracial solidarity against all forms of racism, which sometimes we're not always very good at doing. Thirdly, we need to acknowledge structural racism and think beyond individualized forms of racial violence. So it's not just what happens in the street, but in terms of wider structures and how we as individuals every day might inadvertently participate in those. So what are the everyday practices that we might participate in that might uphold those structures of oppression? Rather than just seeing racism, as something out there committed by other people. We need to relatedly resist the hate crime formulation, which I think individualizes racism and downplays the state role in racial violence. It impacts upon other communities through disproportionate policing, and it doesn't provide really any kind of healing or justice for victims. Number 5, we really need to begin to support our grassroots communities. What we've seen since the outbreak of COVID-19 is a really phenomenal rise in anti-racist activism amongst East and Southeast Asian groups. This is a kind of a historic moment. And I think, even since Atlanta, there's kind of been a new spurt of newer groups. So we need to support them. There are some sort of newer groups such as End the Virus of Racism, and East Scotland, East Southeast Asian Scotland. But there are also older ones such like Kalangong and SIAC, Southeast Asian Centre, Hackney Chinese Community Centre, and sort of intermediate ones, I would say, like DICON and Remember and Resist, who work transnationally. My own project at the moment, as an academic, I'm launching a project on community responses to anti-Asian racial violence. And what I'm hoping to do is to be able to bring together a lot of these organizations and build a kind of online resource hub. But my plea in a sense is to support grassroots communities. You can help resource them through finance, funding, but also time and skills. And then I have 2 more points. Think intersectionally. So it's not just about racism. It's also about how class, gender, sexuality, profession, disability, migration status have massive effects on the way in which we experience racism. So we need to think about which sections of our community do we want to reach out to and who needs the most help. And then I really want to just end with a question for everyone. And I guess this is trying to think about taking responsibility and ownership for anti-racist work. So are we all ready to be good accomplices rather than just good allies? And that means using our power to challenge the status quo in a way that might even risk our own privileges. So there is a huge amount to say. I'm sorry that I've probably talked really fast because I wanted to get through everything, but I'll stop there and hopefully we can pick up on some of these issues in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana, for setting us off. That's great. And I'd now like to move straight on to introduce Anna Chen. So Anna is a Chinese British writer, poet and broadcaster who blogs as Madam Miaow. Anna, over to you.
Hi, well, thank you for having me. My contribution, I didn't read the brief, I'm really sorry, I beg your forgiveness. My contribution today is to make the invisible visible. So America's anti-Chinese pogrom goes full blown. We're seeing almost daily attacks on Asian people who've been caught up in this vicious wave of xenophobia. Britain is thankfully further behind America, but being dragged in the same direction. In the deadly Atlanta attack, 6 out of 8 people who lost their lives were Asian women. After Atlanta, we saw a brief display of crocodile tears from the government and media, but then a return to business as usual. Because this isn't about it's not about being nice to minority victims. This is about turning a group of people, in this case 1.4 billion human beings, into a dehumanized blob, so that the American superpower can retain top position as ruling hegemon in a unipolar world. President Joe Biden finally admitted to what Victor Gao calls Tonya Harding syndrome, with the declining superpower trying to smash the kneecaps of its upcoming rival. Biden declared that China will never grow wealthier or more powerful than us on my watch. That's despite China having 4 times the population, a lot of talent, and an ideological aim to raise the tide that floats all boats. So we've been assailed by a relentless case for the prosecution with no right of reply, obscene stories invented by an obscenely resourced psychological operations campaign. I think there was something like 27,000 public relations people who write these narratives, and they are, they're funded to the tune of billions. So here was Biden threatening that China would not overtake the US by any metric. Now, I first realized that China was the probable end game for the Project for America in the 21st century in 2005, when W. Bush stood in the rubble of a destroyed Iraq and suddenly declared China to be a competitor. It came as America was ticking off its wars in a never-ending stream of horror in this latest round: Iraq, Afghanistan, and Yugoslavia. And I guessed that China stood at the end of that list, probably somewhere near Russia. The same year, so Bush had first called China a competitor during his election campaign in 2000. So the same year as Bush was putting China in the crosshairs, Prime Minister Tony Blair was badly mishandling the outbreak of foot and mouth disease in Britain. The countryside was full of flaming pyres of dead livestock. Farmers were going bust and committing suicide. In March 2001, a government office briefed the press that the outbreak had been started by a Chinese restaurant in the north of England, whose leftovers, they claimed, had contaminated food collected for pig swill. It was absurd. It didn't matter that there was no science to back it up, or that Chinese restaurants buy their meat at the same place as everyone else, the butchers, or that the price of food and meat in the 4th richest economy in the world at that time was at an all-time low, was near an all-time low, meaning that the speculation about antelope meat smuggled in by a Chinese Mr. Big was as unhinged as the vision of herds of wildebeest roaming the plains of the Chinese Serengeti. That is, it didn't exist. So it was enough to use the method favoured by Goebbels that powered this character assassination of linking the scapegoated group to filth and pestilence. And we know that the big lie, if repeated enough times, becomes gospel truth. This was the first time that I had seen a government in the developed world blatantly triggering hate and disgust to divert problems onto a scapegoat. It seemed so crude, so cruel, and archaic. Luckily, most Brits were too sceptical to buy into this, and many seemed quite outraged by it. The minister, Nick Brown, seemed genuinely shocked and ended up publicly vindicating us. But there was no rectification or apology from the press. It was as if this was someone testing out how effective scapegoating us would be. It was like going back in time to the 19th and early 20th centuries, when Yellow Peril imagery dehumanized the Chinese using tropes of over-sexualized, malevolent, dirty other, most famously expressed in Sax Rohmer's Fu Manchu books, whose clever, cruel villain possessed a brow like Shakespeare and a face like Satan. That is to say, he's smarter than us, he's almost like us, but not quite. Fu Manchu was the embodiment of the evil other, which is really only a mirror for all the cruelty we were doing in empire. This vilification of an entire race began in earnest during the 19th century Opium Wars, when Britain forced cheap, mass-produced opium grown in stolen Bengal onto China at gunpoint, turning what had been an expensive aristocratic vice into a nationwide addiction. The narco-capitalists proceeded to smear their victims as subhuman and deserving of the crimes committed against them. Tens of thousands were massacred. Great chunks of China, like Hong Kong, were bitten off by the invading imperial powers that followed Britain. America joined in the opium trade and took advantage of the unfair treaties that were forced onto a weak Qing government. Astor, Forbes, HSBC, Jardine, Matheson, the Midland Bank. The opium trade made fortunes and helped finance the West's industrial revolutions. It was a carve-up to lead to more than a century of suffering from which China's only emerged in the last 40 years. People who are convinced of their own superiority have to justify their savagery against their neighbours on this small blue planet. And, as happened to Native Americans, enslaved Africans, and Aboriginal Australians, among others, they have to dehumanise their victims. So why is this happening now, little more than a decade after China saved the global economy from America's devastating 2008 crash, which threatened to plunge us all into a depression? By allowing global currencies to devalue against the yuan, taking a huge hit in the process, China had acted as the world's shock absorber and stabilised us. China also bought a ton of American debt and helped kickstart the longest bull run in American markets ever. So if you made money from that, just remember how different things could have been. And this is the thanks they get. So why is this hate for China? Unfortunately, the West is in trouble and losing their lead as its capitalism enters a geriatric old age. They've got no universal health care in America, crumbling infrastructure, rising poverty with tent cities springing up everywhere. Treasure is spent on endless wars. The richest 0.1% owns the same as the bottom 90%. The whole system is built on the upward suck of national wealth by the billionaire class who own the government, and they've sucked the country dry. In Britain, austerity laid low the economy, Brexit chaos threatens to finish it off, and COVID mishandling means we are dying in large numbers with no end in sight. Meanwhile, China has the world's only positive GDP growth. It's the world's growth engine, as well as our lifeboat. It invested in its people, raising over 800 million out of absolute poverty. It's built them homes, created jobs, extended life expectancy, and gradually given them a prosperity that Mr. Spock would have been proud of. Live long and prosper might well be the motto of modern China. Not only that, but having stood up to President Trump's vicious trade wars, after some initial fumbles, like that one that I just did, China then protected its people from the new coronavirus. While America mysteriously closed down its pandemic team and the CDC office in Beijing that was supposed to have helped China monitor and contain any new diseases, China identified, sequenced and shared the virus's gene code with international scientists in record time. It amazed the world with its unprecedented lockdown of Wuhan and Hubei province, with a population of 64 million, almost the same size as the British Isles. By day 43 of its 76-day lockdown, China had eradicated the virus bar flare-ups. So China bought us time, which Trump's super spreader policy proceeded to squander, stigmatizing masks, holding massive rallies and playing down the danger, which we now know Trump was aware of in January 2020, right at the start. When Trump performed his U-turn in March 2020, the White House issued instructions for politicians to incessantly blame China. So we've had lab creations, bat soup and twisted timelines, and it's been a revelation as to which politicians and media have gone along with it. They admit that the objective is to contain China. On top of everything else, don't forget, Xinjiang happens to have the second largest oil field in the world, as well as being China's old Silk Route into the Middle East and Europe. Washington's think tanks have stated that their aim is to prepare the American public, or taxpayers as they put it, for competition and conflict. The only thing holding a fractured America together today is hatred for a common enemy. Fears are rising and the motivation is high. As US COVID deaths continue, as US COVID deaths continue, the economy implodes with $28 trillion in debt and rising. Race abuse is getting worse. America needs a pressure valve, and they've decided that China is its safety release. And I just want to finish with saying that I see that the Westworld TV series is a potent metaphor. for the current situation, with Chinese cast as the hosts upon whom the guests can inflict any horror they want. So, to the China haters spinning this atrocity porn, every drop of poison, every toxic word, every lurid rape fantasy, what you're saying about China doesn't tell us who they are, it tells us who you are. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna. Thank you for that powerful contribution. I'll crack straight on and introduce Yao Poon. Now, Yao, I'm very pleased, is able to join us today. He's the chair of the Birmingham Chinese Community Centre, but I know him as a leading member of CARG UK, which is the COVID-19 anti-racism group, which SACU was proud to be an early sponsor of. But over to you, Yao.
Thank you. I was asked to talk about CARC, so I will do that. And I hope that as I talk about CARC, I can also address some of the broader issues that has been raised by Jenny, Diana, and Anna. So what inspired the formation of CARC? CARC was established about a year ago, and we issued our first press statement with 82 signatures around May last year. And when the pandemic began early in 2020, racism and hate crime against people of Chinese, East and Southeast Asian heritage began to spike, as we all know. And the impact was initially noticeable in Chinatowns as businesses reported reduced number of customers. Then as the pandemic spread in Europe and UK, we begin to notice that the mainstream press mostly used images of Chinese people in masks whenever they presented COVID-19 reports, even when the news articles had nothing to do with China or with any other East Asian countries. And there were also, during that period, a lot of misinformation around wet markets and Chinese eating habits. So a group of us began to, who were concerned about this, felt strongly that the media was stoking racism, and still is, by the way, and hate crime against Chinese-looking people by the indiscriminate use of images and news stories. So CARC was formed. Since then, what has CARC done? Well, we wrote several press statements, including an open letter to the Prime Minister. We complained to the press about their indiscriminate use of images. We started a resource page and wrote blogs, as well as invited articles from others. We have ran 2 webinars, the first to learn lessons from how other communities dealt with racism, and the second webinar was on the impact of racism on children. And now we are kind of planning for the third one, possibly in June this year. We also participated in dialogue with institutions such as the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, and the London Met. And we have been active on social media via Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, mainly to raise awareness, encourage sharing of experiences, and to promote solidarity. So that is what we have been doing. But what are CARC objectives and what are our future plans? When CARC started last year, our primary concern was on raising awareness and challenging the mainstream press. However, over the last 12 months, as conditions change, our thinking has evolved. Perhaps it is best if we state first our guiding principles to give us an idea of where we might be going. So the first principle is that CARC will not compete with the British East, South, and Southeast Asian Community, BESCA, community organizations to deliver services. This is because there are already many BESCA community grassroots organizations all over the UK, in many cities and towns, and they are best placed to know their local area and to serve their local communities. Therefore, CARC supported the recently completed project by the Chinese Welfare Trust in partnership with Newham Chinese Association and Protection Approaches to strengthen the capacity of over 30 BESCA community organizations so that they can provide anti-racism services. The second principle that we of our guiding principle is that is that at the time when CARG was established, there was only one other group informed, and that is EVR. Today, however, there are probably over a dozen groups or more than a dozen groups, which is a good thing. This is because racism is a multi-headed beast and must be tackled from different directions by a variety of groups doing different things, putting pressure from different directions. However, each group will need to have some clarity over their niche or mission, and then to collaborate with each other when necessary. There will be some duplication amongst the group, which will require either compromises between the groups or, better still, collaboration between the groups. So, for example, one group has developed a more up-to-date resource asset than CARG has. So, in that kind of situation, CARG needs to rethink how we can best collaborate. What are the gaps that CARG can usefully focus on and leave the rest to the other group who is doing a better job to get on with it? The third principle is collaboration with other communities. CARG believes that it is important to stand in solidarity with and support other minority groups in the fight against racism and hate crime. As a community, although there has always been racism against us, from the Yellow Peril to Fu Manchu has been well illustrated, we are fairly new. As a community, we are fairly new to the fight. And also as institutional and systemic racism affects all of us, we need not just to learn from the other ethnic groups, but also to work with them. This does not mean we do the same things, as some aspects of racism are specific to us as the BESEA community. However, we should collaborate and we should show our faces in support where we can. We must also not forget that there are many white British who are staunch anti-racist as well. One of the important lessons that we pick up from our first webinar with Tell Mama was the importance of being credible if we were to succeed in influencing government policies and holding institutions like the police and the CPS to account. Hence, the most likely development path for CARG that we are thinking of taking is to become a credible anti-racism think tank that can provide reliable information, advocate for BESEA communities, change the xenophobic narratives that we have been hearing about, and support BESEA organizations when needed. It is early days though. Whether CARG can succeed or not, that remains to be seen. Racism against Chinese, South and East Asian people has been with us since the 19th century, as you have heard, and I believe will continue to do so for a long time more yet. Given the current geopolitical tensions resulting from the US attempts to contain China, xenophobia is expected to increase, and we will need to speak up when necessary. Although politicians may say that they distinguish between the Chinese state and the Chinese people, the racist on the street does not do that. So to conclude, currently we have about 320 people signed up as supporters on the CARG website. And CARG itself is run by a group of volunteers from a range of professional backgrounds and ages, younger people in their 20s to older people in their 60s. We are planning to become a charity incorporated organization. But to do that, we actually need more volunteers for the working team and volunteers to form the board of trustees. And we currently do not have enough people to fit in both. So thank you.
Thank you, Yao. That was excellent, explaining the background to the development. Now, before I introduce our final speaker, I just wanted to say this is the last call for any questions you want to post in the Q&A box. We had quite a lot of questions in advance, but obviously there's time enough if you want to contribute any through that mechanism. And I'll be coming to the Q&A after our next speaker. So I'm delighted to introduce Sabby Dhalu, who's the co-convener of Standing Up to Racism. So Sabby, over to you.
Thank you very much, Zoe. It's a real pleasure to be joining this meeting and addressing this very important meeting on Sinophobia and racism towards Chinese and East Asian communities. So I think what the shootings in Atlanta, Georgia, a few weeks ago showed us was that hatred at the top leads to hatred on the ground, because obviously, although Donald Trump is no longer president of the US, for now anyway, his anti-Chinese virus, Kung flu, racism and hatred lives on, unfortunately, as we saw very starkly in the US a few weeks ago. But I think what was really heartening to see from here, just looking at the press coverage there, was the level of solidarity and unity of different communities that experience racism in the US. It was really lovely to see Black Lives Matter placards along with placards saying that we must end anti-Chinese and anti-East Asian racism in the US, because that just illustrates exactly what we need here. We need to have more unity and solidarity between different communities, and understand that an attack on one community is an attack on all of us, because when one community is attacked, so when the government attacks Muslim communities, because obviously the sort of scapegoating and racism that we've seen towards Chinese communities is not the first time we've seen this sort of scapegoating. We've also seen the similar sort of racism, Islamophobia and scapegoating towards the Muslim community in the run-up to things like the war in Iraq and other wars in the Middle East. And I think that Yao Poon is exactly right. I think governments do need to be careful about how they discuss and talk about other states, because hatred and some inflammatory statements about China, or as we saw with inflammatory statements about Afghanistan and Iraq, it leads to anti-Chinese hatred. It leads to racism and attacks on the ground, just as we saw with the Muslim communities and wars on the Middle East. So we do need to be careful. But I think what that racism shows is that whenever there's an attack on one community, you may see a specific attack and a particular rise in attacks on that community, but it does also lead to attacks on other communities. It is true. It's not just something that we say. An attack on one of us does lead to an attack on all of us. When you see racist attacks rise against one community, they always rise against other communities as well. And that's what the most recent racist attack statistics showed last year, that attacks on all different communities increased across the board. So it does really illustrate the need for us to all be united in opposing all forms of racism, and how we have to, all different communities that experience racism must be united together. But we also have to work with other anti-racists, like in the trade union movement, in the labour movement, and all progressives and anti-racists across society. And I think it's important to remember the context in which this racism is being whipped up. We're seeing a very carefully orchestrated campaign by the US, the West, in Europe and in Britain, of whipping up racism to scapegoat, to distract and divide in the context of their abject failure in response to dealing with the coronavirus. So, and ironically, countries that are getting racist attacks, those countries are actually doing a very good job in actually suppressing the virus. All of the range of sort of East Asian countries have done quite a good job, like Australia, China, South Korea, Vietnam. They've pursued a zero COVID strategy, but the West haven't actually done that. And so because of that failure, they're using racism to distract and divide the population, particularly as we're approaching a set of elections. So in France, you're seeing Macron attacking Muslims. Okay, Biden isn't doing it so much now, but obviously Trump, we saw, really sort of whipped up inflammatory statements towards China, and also attacks on the Black Lives Matter movement. Here, we sort of seem to be going down a similar road. So we saw Priti Patel attacking Black Lives Matter. We saw that dreadful Commission on Racism and Ethnic Disparities report last week. I mean, I'm glad it's got such a load of backlash from Black communities, because it's just a straightforward right-wing ideological denial of racism in the context of you know, COVID-19 laying very starkly and being very bare the level of racism in society, because we've seen the disproportionate impact of COVID on BAME communities. That's because of institutional racism. It's got nothing to do with geography. I mean, those other factors, age, underlying health factors, they are factors, but racism is a factor. The fact that Filipino nurses are dying disproportionately, the fact that other Black, Asian, other community, ethnic minority community doctors and nurses are complaining more of a lack of PPE and being targeted to work on COVID wards more than their white counterparts. That's institutional racism, and that is being denied at the moment. We've also seen the government trying to blame Muslim communities for celebrating Eid last summer. We've seen attacks on Chinese communities. We've also seen attacks on refugees and attempting to, you know, stop them from crossing the channel, and discussions about legislation sticking refugees in camps abroad. This is all a racist distraction technique to divert attention away from their policies that have led in this country to, according to the ONS, 150,000 dead because of COVID. That is one of the worst death tolls in the world, certainly if you measure it in terms of proportion per proportion of the population. And in addition, the economic impact has been terrible, because they've been busy, you know, prioritizing profits over actually supporting the people and doing what's best for the majority of people. So racism is used to distract from this. And finally, I think what all of this shows, what the, you know, the way the government used the commission that was reported last week to deny any role of institutional racism, when it's very clear, research after research after research has shown that there is institutional racism that needs to be explored and examined further in the light of COVID, which has led to more BAME communities dying during COVID. We've seen Islamophobia whipped up, Sinophobia whipped up, we've seen attacks on refugees whipped up. What this shows is that we need to have unity against racism. We have to have solidarity amongst all of our different communities. We have to stand up to all forms of Islamophobia, whether it's racism, whether it's Islamophobia, Sinophobia, and attacks on any other community. And we have to be united, and we have to work with all anti-racists and progressives, and certainly from Stand Up to Racism. I'm definitely looking forward to working with all the different organizations, and I'm so pleased that CARG and End the Virus of Racism have been set up in response to this growing level of xenophobia. So thank you very much for inviting me here today, and I look forward to hopefully answering some questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Sabby, and thank you to the whole panel. I think we've had some excellent contributions from a number of perspectives. So what we're going to do now is move into the Q&A bit. So I've got a little team, Iris and Ros particularly, who are compiling your questions. And it's always interesting when you say last call, we suddenly get a flurry. So they're having to work rather hard, but they have already had some questions in advance. So I'm going to read the questions out in groups of 3. And then I think I'll simply, because it's difficult to orchestrate without some control, I'm literally going to go through the panel again in the same order. So I'll ask, you know, Diana if she's got anything she wants to say, Anna, Yeow, and Sabby, and then we'll get the next group of questions. Okay, so that's the plan. So I'll start with the first 3 I've been sent. So the first question is, the SACU advert for this event on Facebook has sadly attracted a number of negative and unfriendly comments. We wonder how much of a problem is abuse on social media for Chinese people, and what should be done about it. So that's a good one, which is back to our brief for the event, which is about practical ideas. The second question for you to think about is, how do we stop or minimize the anti-China reports of the press and the BBC? How can the media be persuaded to do more to report positive images of Chinese people? And the third question sent in was, how does CARG or more generally any anti-BE/FBA racism groups fund their activities? What are they going to do to generate their funds? That's obviously another practical question. So, okay, panel, you've got a sense of that first group of questions. So I'll start. Sorry, Diana, you're going to have to go least amount of time to think. So your first one up, please, if you can give us any thoughts, and then I'll move us through the.
Sure. Okay, I just wanted to say very, very quickly before I go on to the questions, just to clarify a misunderstanding for one of the questions. I think people thought I was talking about Falun Gong. I never raised Falun Gong at all. So what I was talking about is Kalungun, which is, I don't think I'm pronouncing it particularly correctly, but it's a Filipino consortium for migrants. Okay, so just to clarify that, because I've seen quite a few comments about that, so I wanted to be clear, I wasn't talking about Falun Gong. About the question about social media, yeah, I think there are some reports that there was something like a 900% increase in xenophobic, anti-Chinese, racist content on social media since COVID-19. So, I mean, it is a huge problem. In terms of what can be done, it's difficult to know. I mean, I was hoping to be able to start this research project which looked at that very question and looked at tracking those and then creating some sort of templates with which you could, you know, pressure social media organizations to actually employ sort of filters to actually stop them. I mean, there is the other issue about sort of COVID-related pictures always showing Asian people, Chinese Asian people, as though somehow, you know, that kind of re-racializes the virus. And there's another community grassroots organization called BESEA, B-E-S-E-A, if you're interested in them. They are doing work specifically on what we can do to combat sort of racialized representations of East and Southeast Asians. So I recommend them. I can't remember quite what the second question was. In terms of funding, funding is interesting. I mean, they're very, very much kind of having to fundraise through petitions online, you know, depending on private donations. There is a little bit also of applying to sort of organizations for grassroots funding. But as we know, everyone is now completely stretched in terms of grassroots funding, which is why people are turning to private sources of funding in order to fund their organizations. And I guess this is why I'm kind of like encouraging people to seek out these organizations and to help resource them. And it's not just necessarily about money, it's also about time. You can donate your time, you can donate your skills, your knowledge, and you can volunteer with these organizations. So please do help.
Thanks, Diana. That's some good practical suggestions there. Lovely. Anna.
Yes. Hi. You want me to
Yeah, any thoughts on that bundle of questions? Any ideas or comments?
I think it's difficult. It'd be lovely to get the press to give us, you know, to give us a fair hearing. But so far, well, for example, The Guardian has had its comments closed for several years. There's quite clearly a case for the prosecution that's going on for geopolitical reasons. So while I admire everybody, you know, saying, well, look, why are you publishing photos? You know, why are you clearly directing hate towards us? I think there is an agenda, and while that agenda goes on, we're just not going to get any different. I would actually say that maybe I said this to Jenny before, maybe a letter writing campaign, because they're supposed to, you know, they're supposed to be fair, they're supposed to have balance. You know, this is what our fourth estate, and in particular the news outlets are supposed to do. But
okay, we might try a campaign.
Yeah. Or Ros, would you, maybe in the next round if there's time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So shall I move on to Yeow at the moment then? Yeow?
I'll start with the funding one. CARG has done so far what it has done without any money, because as I think Diana said, if we volunteer, there's a lot that we can do. Of course, there will come a point when money is needed, but there's so much we can do before we even need to have money for it. And in our case, the website is the only one that requires money, and one of the core members of CARG just pay for the website. The second point about funding is that because the competition for funds are so high, there are so many groups out there from so many groups all asking for money. It's not easy to get funding or to get grants from. And so in order to get to the point where we can get grant funding, we need to have a track record. So groups like CARG that is fairly newly formed make really no track record of managing fund. So we will have to do things first without money until we build up sufficient track record of the things we. Then when we apply for funding, our chances of success will be higher. The thing about the press, like Anna, I also think that it's actually quite a difficult thing to do because the door is closed at the moment against us. Remember, I mentioned earlier that CARG is thinking of doing another seminar in June, and at the moment the topic being discussed is it's about the mass media. So in the next few weeks, while we debate about the kind of what we're going to do in that third webinar, it will probably be something around the press. So if any of you has ideas that you want to contribute, please get in touch and talk to me.
Thanks, Yao. And Sabby, any thoughts on that bundle of questions?
Yes, actually. And I think the question on the media was very, very interesting. It's a very good question. And the first thing that came to my mind was, well, if you wanted any evidence of institutional racism and its existence, the media is a very good example of that. And I think it is a difficult one because obviously, a lot of the media is, privately owned. I mean, even the BBC has an agenda, if we're honest. So it is a very difficult one. But I think in my experience, they do respond to complaints. So if you see something that you're particularly outraged about, if you find, some imbalanced reporting on COVID and you feel it's sort of blaming China or Chinese communities in some way or any other community, because obviously there's COVID's thrown up lots of different forms of racism. So I think actually complaining has a big impact, and encouraging your supporters on your email list to send in complaints. They do get rattled when they get a large volume of complaints about one thing. So that can have an impact. And then I agree with Anna. I think, using the letters pages in the print press is also another good way of actually getting your point across, and, other people might be convinced by, some of the arguments put forward in the letters page. And I think, unfortunately, it sometimes is down to us to show a bit of balance when it comes to press coverage. So I thought that was a good question. And I do think, just one final point regarding the media, I do think that, we needed, what we really need is a public inquiry into racism and COVID, because there's been so many different things, and we really do need to examine the role of the media, in racism and how it perpetuates racism, how it leads to racist attacks and its inflammatory coverage, because, something like that is very long overdue. And then regarding funding, I think that the best way of actually raising funds, in my experience right now, is the independent sources of funding that you can get, like crowd funds, things like that. You literally just set it up and you just ask people to donate. You can raise thousands of pounds just by doing something like that. So if it's just a case of, finding the money for, a bit of a, some leaflets or a campaign or a website or something like that, then you set up a crowdfund. I think that's probably the best way of doing it. I mean, we're a membership organisation, so we get a lot of money through our members. We've got a good relationship with trade union movement, so we get, affiliation fees and donations from the trade union movement as well. We're able to do that because we sort of represent a whole range of different communities and work with a whole different range of communities that tackle a lot of different types of racism. So that might be difficult if we're just looking at one particular form of racism. Yeah, I mean, that's what we do, but I certainly recommend from my own experience, crowdfunding is a very good way of raising funds if that's an issue at the moment.
That's great. Thank you for that bundle. I'm on to my next bundle of questions now. So listen up, panel. Now we've got a whole load of sort of similar questions that have come in via the Q&A, but we've summarized, if you like, to 3 questions here, which is, how do you think Sinophobia has influenced Western commentary on the situation in Xinjiang? The second question, to what extent is racism against Chinese part of the rise in right-wing nationalism, which escalated over Brexit? And number 3, what particularly can people do in Britain right now? Because that's back to our brief. That's what we're looking for your help on, please. So I'll start off again with poor Diana's got least time to think about it. Fire ahead, Diana.
Okay, I'm not actually sure I heard the second question because I was still thinking about the first. I guess in terms of Sinophobia and Xinjiang, I mean, I guess, you know, one of the issues is that, you know, because there is a kind of Sinophobia and people don't want to appear racist towards Chinese people, they feel like then that they can't criticize the state, okay? But, you know, I think many of us feel that you can do those things at the same time, okay? So that even if we want to defend against racism towards everyday Chinese people globally, that doesn't mean to say that we necessarily want to defend the state of China and what it's doing. So these questions often get very, very muddled. And the same thing happens with, you know, in relation to Israel and anti-Semitism, okay? But we need to separate out those issues and be able to talk about them separately without muddying them. So that would be my very first point. The second question I didn't hear, it was something about Brexit. I lost it.
To what extent is racism against Chinese part of a rise in right-wing nationalism, which kind of escalated over Brexit?
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, all of this, you know, I think Sabby was kind of like giving us the broader context. We always need to see this within the broader context. And yes, absolutely, you know, issues around Brexit, that opens the kind of door to kind of like legitimizing widespread racist discourse. And again, you know, Trump again legitimizing it further. So we always need to see it in these broader context. I think one of the first questions was about has the attacks got to do with Trump? And yes, of course, you know, it's related to that legitimizing of the discourse. But as we've heard, these are also discourses that go back centuries. So this is nothing new, and this is why they're so easy to take hold in people's imaginations. And lastly, in terms of what can we do in Britain right now, I guess I spent most of my talk talking about that, about anti-racist resistance, expanding our political imagination. So we do that not only with the Chinese, it's about East and Southeast Asians, it's about all the different racialized communities, Black, African, Caribbean communities, Muslim communities, South Asian communities, anti-Roma racism, anti-traveler racism. We need to tackle all these different forms of racism at the same time, as well as, you know, issues around, you know, homophobia, around LGBTQ rights, you know, these inequalities and injustices, they intersect. We need to band together in order to fight them simultaneously. We cannot just tackle one because it will not dismantle the structures of repression.
Thanks, Diana. That's great. And then Anna, any contributions on this one?
Yeah, I think one problem with Xinjiang, and the same with Hong Kong and the other attacks that are coalescing on China now, is there hasn't been a public debate You know, I would have liked to have seen a proper discussion about what we think is going on in Xinjiang, what is really going on in Xinjiang. And in the absence of judicially verifiable evidence that even the International Criminal Court have said they can't stand this up, the World Bank said they can't stand up the accusations, and the Americans' own State Department lawyers said they can't call it genocide. So it is such a mess. It's being used for geopolitical arguments. It's, you know, so what we're getting is this whole mix of messages, which is, well, you know, Uyghur people, out of all the, you know, minorities, people are focusing on Uyghurs, but then, wow, they were exempt from the one-child policy. Some of them have 3. Their life expectancy is going up. Their numbers are going up. They're found in all walks of life. So you've got these competing narratives going on. And because it seems that the powers that be want one particular narrative to stand up, we're not getting a whole 360-degree view of it. So I'm sure there is friction in Xinjiang. There's obviously some sort of friction, because otherwise you wouldn't have had the terrorism that they had. You know, are we going to compare the American war on terror with the way China carried out its war on terror, which seems to be they're trying to achieve it through eradicating poverty, as they see as a breeding ground. But until we get honesty in the media here, where we can hear, you know, voices. I mean, I would love to see films of what's going on in Xinjiang, not with the BBC and their grey filters and their twisting, you know, like Orgreave, where they take things out, put them in a different order in film. So I'm just stumped. I do believe there is not genocide going on. If you look at genocide as what happened to the Jews in the, you know, in Germany, in Europe, which is an actual attack on their gene, you know, just the just existing as a Jew meant that you were a target for Nazis. That's obviously not going on in a place where there are 24,000 mosques and so on. But there's something going on, and
yeah,
you know, I'd like to see a fair debate.
Yeah. Okay. I'm conscious of I'm being sent reminders that we've only got a short time left, and we've got a whole load more questions. So sorry, Yao. Can I ask for a response, which is unfair because I'm longer.
It'll be very short. Just to say that I generally agree with what Anna has said, and that's it. We need a more informed debate around the issues, which we have not got at all, from the press, from the political parties, even the one that I'm part of, the Lib Dem party. There just isn't that debate at all, but policies are being made. The last question about getting involved, I think possibly more of us need to take an interest and get involved in politics, and to begin to try to challenge some of the prevailing narratives. Just talking amongst ourselves is not going to do it. We need to actually get our hands in.
Good. Okay. Thanks. And Sabby?
Yes, thank you. Very interesting questions. So I'll try and be as quick as possible. So firstly, I think on Brexit and racism, well, whatever you thought about Brexit and whatever side you stood on that debate, I think there is no doubt that it led to a rise in racism. And it wasn't just about EU migrants. It was very clear. It just led to a load of racism across the board, loads of different communities, African communities, Indian communities, Pakistani communities, no doubt Chinese communities also. Experienced a rise in racist attacks in the weekend after the referendum, and that did continue, unfortunately. So I think that has led to a lot of racism, which we're seeing now. And what we've seen also is the leadership of the Conservative Party reflects that sort of wing of the current government, reflects that wing of the Conservative Party. And I think they are quite which is not just about Brexit. I think, you know, that they are using racism in order to, you know, inflict enormous attacks on the working class, which actually includes sort of, Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities. And so you've got a sort of Enoch Powell-like sort of government in power now, which is quite serious. It's something we need to get our heads around, because Enoch Powell was sort of sacked as Shadow Defence Secretary in 1968 and was on the sort of, fringes of the Conservative Party. And now you've got the sort of Powellites in charge now, which is, I think it's a helpful way of actually understanding what's going on politically. I think on Xinjiang and the Uyghur question and Sinophobia, well, I've got slightly, perhaps a different take on this, because, and I don't want to get into the debate, because which sort of leads into the final, answering the final question, which is how do you fight racism? What do we actually do? Well, one thing we've discussed is that you need unity of different communities. And what we say in Stand Up to Racism is that actually Chinese communities, Muslim communities, Jewish communities, Black, African, Caribbean, Indian, Pakistani communities, African communities all need to be united against all forms of racism here. And unfortunately, that does mean that we have to keep out a lot of those other difficult debates that I know people really want to discuss. And I think it's important that there is a forum for such discussions, for these issues. But we say in the anti-racist movement here, let's keep that out. Because if you have a debate about Xinjiang, you'll have people here that think one thing. You'll have Muslim communities in the anti-racist movement saying, having a different view that are sort of more supportive of, the sort of pro-Uyghur kind of side of the debate. Ditto with Israel, Palestine. You'll have Muslims and Jews with different opinions and so on. So we say, let's keep these international debates out of the anti-racist movement, and let's unite against all different forms of racism. So food for thought, that one. And then finally, other practical things. Well, I would join and support the call for a public inquiry into COVID-19 and racism, because that should obviously just look at the media and xenophobia and anti-Chinese racism. And also, I think opposing the policing bill is quite important as well, because freedom of speech, I know it's been difficult with lockdown and everything to actually protest, but that is a fundamental right that we have to defend. And it is, anti-racist campaigning and demonstrations is an important part of that, which is explicitly being clamped down in this legislation.
Thank you so much, panel. Now, we're running out of time, so I can't put these really interesting questions that are coming through, including people will be interested to hear your panel's comments on recent popular culture representations such as Crazy Rich Asians and Bling Empire. So there's all sorts of good questions I could have put to you, but I think we're going to have to stop it here. We've got lots coming through the chat, and we'll certainly be reading them and reviewing them. I think you've given us some fabulous pointers as to practical things we can do to stand together and to fight racism together. And I think that's been really, really helpful. But I don't want to cut into the final bit, because when we were thinking how to end today, we wanted to take another angle on it. So we're delighted that Ken Chang, who's a British-born Chinese comedian and BBC New Comedy Award finalist, is going to end this evening for us. So this is the end of the panel. And, I'd just like to thank you all so much for your contribution. You've been really fabulous. And to say we will close with Ken taking us away for, I don't know how a comedian does a stand-up performance when he's sitting down in a Zoom room, but I leave that to him. So thank you very much, everybody, and we'll close with Ken. Ken, can I hand over to you?
Yes, hello. Thanks for having me. Always good to follow up a serious debate about genocide with some stand-up comedy. I love it. Is there a way to pin me on the screen, or do I need to be pinned? Is it okay like this? Can everyone see me? Oh, I can't hear you right now.
Everyone on speaker view, we can do it that way, I think. So.
Oh, sure. But I'm on speaker view and I'm not coming up as the speaker, which I think might be an issue. It doesn't matter too much. I think it'll be fine. Most of it is words. I'll just get going, and if you can do that, that'll be fine. Yeah, I'm Ken. Thank you. Spotlighted. I need the spotlight. I'm British-born Chinese, probably one of the top 5 Chinese comedians working in the UK. That's not a brag. There's only like 3 of us. So, what's it like being a Chinese comedian? The truth is, it's actually very easy. It's much easier than being any other minority of comedian. It's much easier than being a female comedian because no one ever comes up to me after a gig and says, "You were pretty funny," for a Chinese comedian. No one ever prefaces a compliment with the phrase, "I don't usually find Chinese people funny," partly because that is never the case. Most people find the Chinese fucking hysterical. It's true. One stereotype that comes with being Chinese is we're very good academically. People often assume I'm amazing with maths and numbers, which is frustrating because I am. I'm actually amazing. And it's frustrating because I hate justifying their prejudice with my sick mathematical skills. I wasn't very cool in school. I always wished I was cool. You know how some kids are too cool for school? Well, I was the exact amount of cool for school, which is not very cool. I was the only Chinese kid in my class. It was always me and a bunch of white kids. It very much felt like I was in a film where I'd been added to the cast so it'd sell well in the China market. I was always a token in my friendship group. In fact, they even called me Token. At least that's what they put on my Christmas cards. Sure, there was a space between the toe and the Ken, but the point remains the same, I feel. I was very bad at sports in school. I was very bad at sports. I remember one time I was playing football at lunch and I just forgot which team I was on. After that, I was just running around trying to not affect the game for either one side or the other. It's very hard to add a level of ambiguity to team sports. There was a lot of me running sideways in that situation, a lot of me running near the person with the ball, being like, am I going to tackle you? Or am I just here to offer you emotional support? Eventually someone called me out and they were like, Ken, what the hell are you doing? And I had to just be like, look, I don't know which team I'm on. Naturally, being Chinese, I have a lot to say about coronavirus, especially as I created it in a lab, I think. That's what the well-informed members of the Twitter community seem to suggest anyway, that I, Ken Cheng, a professional comedian, am the sole inventor of COVID-19. I don't remember this happening, of course, but when you read a claim from a stranger on the internet who has 19 followers and a profile picture of a full English breakfast, you tend to trust their sources. About this time last year, before lockdown, I actually got asked to go on CNN to talk about the rise of racism because of the virus. Around that time, for about a month, I had about 8 or 9 interview requests. And the first question they always asked me was, have you experienced anyone treating you differently since the outbreak? And I was like, well, mainly I'm getting way more interview requests. My career is really taking off because of this virus. It was a great time for me generally. I actually miss it when only Chinese people had the virus. Like, that was our thing. White people just never let us have our own thing. They always just gotta take it. I'll say it. Getting coronavirus is cultural appropriation, okay? In all seriousness, I didn't actually encounter that much racism in public around that period. The main thing I got was my flatmate, Ted, told me that his mum warned him to be careful of me. Let's just say I didn't have to top up the gas bill that month. I did get a lot of abuse online, though. People would often tweet me. We've talked a lot about online abuse. People would often tweet me saying things like, this is all your fault. You are the virus. Please stay away from my son, Ted. You know, the usual common racist things. They still tweet me a lot to this day. I get constant tweets whenever I tweet about anything. I get a lot of tweets asking me, when will you condemn your homeland for causing this virus? You see, not only did I create the virus, it was my homeland, the country of China, not the UK where I was born and have lived all my life. China helped spread coronavirus around the world, which, according to the same people, is also a hoax and doesn't exist. I talk a lot about racism in my shows. How much time do I have left? I think I started a bit late, but I'll just go for a bit longer. I talk a lot about racism in my shows, and it can be quite tricky, especially in places which aren't very diverse. I just before lockdown, I was doing more and more gigs around the UK, and one thing that's become clear is we now live in a very deeply divided country, and the main thing that people are divided over is whether or not they think my jokes are funny. Which is not good. I've done gigs in a lot of places in kind of places which are 98% white British, very different from London where I live. 98% white British. I don't think they've even seen a Chinese person before, especially one who's not doing some form of martial arts. And these gigs can be very tricky because a lot of my material is stories of incredibly racist things people have said to me. And it's very hard to do that material when you're not entirely sure the audience aren't the same people who would say those things. They're just like, yep, that is what we would say. This is very relatable content. Someone just taking notes in the corner. They think it's a TED talk on how to speak to minorities. I'll tell you one more story before I go because I think we're running over. I was performing in a small village in the Scottish borders, and a man came up to me in the interval, and he'd just seen the first half of my show, all about race, all about racism, and he opened with this. He said, "Would it be okay if I said something mildly racist towards you right now?" I've never had that happen to me before, someone asking me for consent before they racially abuse me. Like, is this a new thing? Like how GDPR changed internet cookies? They make you click accept now. Anyway, I said yes because I'm Chinese, but I'm also British Chinese, so I'm very polite. He then pointed to the menu on the bar, and he pointed out that the items on the menu are numbered, and he turned to me and he said, "This must make you feel right at home." I don't know how to break it to him, but I don't live in a Chinese takeaway. And even if I did, I wouldn't be using the menu to order food at home. That doesn't make any sense. But I didn't say any of that. I just laughed politely. And he then said, "Are you going to use that joke in your stand-up?" And I thought, in a way. That's the entirety of my set. Thank you very much. I meant to close the show. I think we won't throw it back to anyone. So thank you to everyone for organizing this. Thank you to all the panelists and SACU for organizing the event, and hope you all learned a lot and enjoyed it. Thank you very much. I've been Ken Cheng.
Yay.
Yay.